The Sunset Motel sat like a forgotten grave on Route 66, its neon sign dark for 15 years. Sarah Chen pulled into the cracked parking lot, her German Shepherd Max whimpering in the back seat as desert wind rattled the boarded windows. 8 months pregnant and running from her ex-husband's threats, she'd bought this place sight unseen with her grandmother's inheritance money. It was supposed to be her sanctuary, but Max refused to go near room 7. The door hung slightly open despite Sarah's certainty she'd locked every room the day before. Inside, beneath peeling wallpaper and years of dust, she found something impossible, a photograph of herself as a child, standing in this very room with a woman she'd never seen before. The woman wore Sarah's grandmother's necklace, the one supposedly buried with her. Sarah's hands shook as she turned the photo over. Written in her grandmother's handwriting were 4 words that made her blood freeze: "She's coming for you." Who was the woman in the photograph, and why had Sarah's grandmother hidden the truth about this place for 30 years? Sarah stumbled backward, her free hand instinctively protecting her swollen belly as the photograph fluttered to the stained carpet. The baby kicked hard, as if sensing her distress, and she pressed her back against the doorframe for support. Max's agitated barking echoed from the parking lot, where he paced in tight circles beside her rusty Honda Civic. The motel had been her grandmother's secret. That much was becoming clear now. When the lawyer had handed her the deed along with Grandmother Chen's will, Sarah had assumed it was just another investment property, something her grandmother had acquired and forgotten about during her later years. The old woman had always been shrewd with money, collecting rental properties across 3 states before dementia claimed her memories. But this felt different, personal. Sarah forced herself to pick up the photograph again, studying every detail under the weak afternoon light filtering through the grimy window. The little girl in the picture couldn't have been more than 6 years old, with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile that Sarah recognized from her own childhood photos. She wore a yellow sundress that triggered a distant memory, something about a road trip, ice cream that melted too fast, and her grandmother's nervous laughter. The woman beside her in the photograph was tall and angular, with dark hair pulled back severely and eyes that seemed to look right through the camera. She had one hand resting on young Sarah's shoulder, the other touching the jade necklace at her throat, the same necklace Sarah remembered kissing goodbye when they closed her grandmother's casket. A gust of wind slammed the door shut behind her, and Sarah jumped, her heart hammering against her ribs. The room plunged into near darkness, with only thin slivers of light creeping around the edges of boarded windows. She fumbled for her phone's flashlight, illuminating water stains on the ceiling that formed strange patterns, almost like symbols. Max's barking grew more frantic outside. Sarah could hear his claws scratching against the door, and she knew she should leave, should get back to the relative safety of her car and drive away from this place. But something kept her rooted in spot, staring at the photograph that shouldn't exist. Her grandmother had raised her after her parents died in the car accident. Those early years were a blur of grief counseling and new schools, but Sarah had always felt safe with Grandmother Chen. The old woman was practical, no nonsense, with little patience for ghost stories or family mysteries. She'd taught Sarah to change a tire, balance a checkbook, and trust her instincts above all else. So why had she never mentioned the Sunset Motel? Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message, and she nearly dropped the photograph again. The notification showed David's name, and her stomach clenched with familiar dread. Even 3 states away, her ex-husband couldn't leave her alone. "Found your car registration. I know where you went. Come home or I'll come get you." She deleted the message without responding, just like the dozen others she'd received since leaving Phoenix. David's threats had become white noise, a constant hum of menace that she'd learned to tune out. But here, in this strange room that somehow held pieces of her forgotten past, his words felt more ominous. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Sarah realized she'd been holding her breath. She needed air, needed space to think, needed to get away from the oppressive atmosphere of room 7. But as she reached for the door handle, her flashlight caught something else, scratches in the wood near the lock, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. Or in. Max's barking suddenly stopped, replaced by a low, threatening growl that Sarah had only heard him make once before, the night David had raised his hand to her for the last time. Something was out there, moving around her car in the gathering dusk. The crying started again at 3 in the morning, echoing through the thin walls of the motel office where Sarah had set up a makeshift nursery. Emma's wails seemed amplified in the empty building, bouncing off decades-old wallpaper and cracked linoleum floors. Sarah stumbled from her cot, muscle memory guiding her through the darkness to the portable crib she'd positioned near the front desk. "Shh, baby girl," she whispered, lifting Emma's warm, squirming body against her chest. Through the grimy window, she could see the neon skeleton of the motel's sign casting eerie shadows across the courtyard. Only half the letters still worked, spelling out Suet Mel in flickering pink light. As Emma settled back to sleep, Sarah found herself wide awake, studying the layout of her new home. 12 rooms total, arranged in an L shape around a cracked swimming pool that had been drained years ago. The previous owner, a gruff man named Pete Hernandez, had warned her about the place during the sale. "Most folks won't stay here anymore," he'd said, avoiding her eyes. "Not since what happened in '73. But you seem like you need a place, and I need to sell." Sarah had pressed him for details, but Pete had clammed up, muttering something about old news and better left alone. She'd assumed he meant the motel's reputation had suffered from neglect and time. Every roadside establishment had its stories. Now, pacing the office with Emma in her arms, she wondered if there was more to it. The building felt heavy somehow, weighted with an atmosphere she couldn't quite name. During the day, sunlight helped dispel the feeling, but at night, the sensation crept back like fog rolling in from the highway. A soft thud from somewhere in the courtyard made her freeze. She moved to the window, peering through the dusty glass. Nothing moved in the pale wash of the security light she'd had installed last week. Probably just a cat, or debris blown by the desert wind. But as she turned away, movement caught her eye. The door to room 7 stood slightly ajar. Sarah's pulse quickened. She was certain she'd checked all the rooms yesterday, making sure they were locked. Room 7 had been sealed tight, the key hanging on the numbered hook behind the front desk where it belonged. She glanced down at Emma, who slept peacefully now, her tiny fist curled against Sarah's shoulder. Going outside to investigate meant waking the baby or leaving her alone in the office. Neither option appealed to her. Instead, Sarah retrieved the heavy flashlight from beneath the register and aimed its beam through the window toward room 7. The door was definitely open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond the threshold. As she watched, a piece of paper fluttered out onto the concrete walkway, carried by the night breeze. The rational part of her mind supplied explanations. The lock was old and faulty, the wind had blown the door open, desert motels were full of drafts and settling sounds, and perfectly logical reasons for things that seemed strange at first glance. But Sarah had learned to trust her instincts during the long months of her pregnancy, when David's behavior had grown increasingly erratic. Those same instincts now told her that something was wrong with room 7. She waited until sunrise, watching the door from her perch by the window. It remained open, that single piece of paper trapped against the walkway railing like a white flag of surrender. When Emma woke for her morning feeding, Sarah made a decision. After changing and feeding the baby, she strapped Emma into the portable carrier and stepped outside. The desert morning was crisp and clear, yesterday's oppressive heat not yet building. Birds called from the scrubby bushes that had overtaken the far end of the parking lot. Room 7 looked less ominous in daylight. Just another faded door painted the same turquoise as its neighbors. Sarah approached slowly, her keys jangling softly in her free hand. The paper by the railing turned out to be a fast food wrapper, probably blown in from the highway. She pushed the door wider and stepped inside. The room was identical to the others she'd inspected, 2 double beds with sagging mattresses, a small table and chairs, a bathroom with avocado green fixtures from the motel's heyday. Dust motes danced in the shaft of sunlight streaming through the gap in the heavy curtains. But something felt different about this space. Sarah couldn't pinpoint what exactly. The air seemed thicker, charged with an energy that made her skin prickle. Emma stirred restlessly in her carrier, making small sounds of distress. On the nightstand between the beds, barely visible beneath a layer of dust, something caught the morning light. Sarah moved closer and found herself staring at a small silver locket, tarnished with age but unmistakably familiar. Her hand rose unconsciously to her throat, where an identical locket had hung for as long as she could remember. The baby's cries pierced through Sarah's restless sleep at 3 a.m. She stumbled from the pull-out couch in what used to be the motel office, her bare feet finding the cold linoleum floor. Emma's wails echoed strangely in the empty building, bouncing off the walls like ghosts of conversations long past. "Shh, sweetheart," Sarah whispered, lifting her daughter from the makeshift crib she'd fashioned from a dresser drawer. The baby's face was red and scrunched, tiny fists pumping with indignation. "I know this isn't exactly the nursery I promised you." As she paced the narrow office space, trying to calm Emma, Sarah's gaze drifted through the window toward the row of motel rooms. The moonlight cast long shadows across the cracked pavement, and she could swear she saw movement near room 7. She pressed her face closer to the glass, Emma still fussing in her arms. Nothing. Just the wind stirring debris across the parking lot. But as she turned away, a flash of light caught her peripheral vision. This time she was certain. A brief flicker, like a flashlight beam, had swept across the window of room 7 before disappearing. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd checked every room yesterday and they were all empty. The doors were locked, the windows boarded up from the inside. She'd even tested the electricity. Most of it had been shut off years ago. Emma's crying subsided to soft whimpers as Sarah rocked her gently, but her eyes remained fixed on the dark row of rooms. She should call the police, but what would she tell them? That she saw a light in her own property? They'd probably assume she was a paranoid new mother seeing things that weren't there. Maybe she was. The stress of the move, the divorce paperwork still sitting unsigned on her kitchen table back in Phoenix, the overwhelming reality of renovating this place while caring for a newborn. It was enough to make anyone's mind play tricks on them. But then she saw it again, definitely a light, moving methodically from one side of room 7's window to the other. Sarah grabbed her phone, and the heavy flashlight she'd been using since the power situation was still questionable. Emma had finally dozed off, so she placed her back in the drawer crib and pulled on her boots. The baseball bat she'd kept by her bedside since the divorce proceedings felt reassuring in her other hand. The night air was sharp against her skin as she stepped outside. The desert cold was something she was still adjusting to, how the temperature could drop 40 degrees once the sun disappeared. Her breath formed small clouds as she approached room 7, each step deliberate and quiet. The door was exactly as she'd left it, locked, with a rusty key she'd found in the office filing cabinet. But as she drew closer, she noticed something that made her blood run cold, fresh footprints in the dust around the door, boot prints that were definitely not hers. She raised the flashlight, her thumb hovering over the switch. Whatever was in there, whoever was in there, would know she was coming the moment she turned it on. But the alternative, standing in the dark with an intruder just feet away, seemed worse. The light beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the door and windows of room 7. Everything appeared normal, undisturbed. She moved to the window and tried to peer through a gap in the boards, but the angle was wrong. That's when she heard it. A soft scraping sound from inside the room, like something being dragged across the floor. "Hello?" she called out, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "This is private property. I'm calling the police." The scraping stopped immediately. Sarah fumbled for her phone with one hand while keeping the flashlight trained on the door. But before she could dial, she heard the distinct sound of a window being forced open from the back of the building. She ran around the corner of the motel, her boots crunching on gravel and broken glass. The beam of her flashlight swept wildly as she searched for whoever had been in the room. In the distance, she caught a glimpse of a figure running toward the desert, moving quickly between the scattered Joshua trees. "Hey!" she shouted, but the figure disappeared into the darkness beyond her light's reach. Sarah stood there for several minutes, breathing heavily, listening to the silence of the desert night. A coyote howled somewhere in the distance, answered by another from a different direction. The sound made her skin crawl. When she finally returned to the front of room 7, she noticed something she'd missed before. Carved into the wooden doorframe, barely visible in the weathered wood, were the initials SC followed by a date from 25 years ago. Her maiden name was Sarah Chen. The date was exactly 3 months before her birth. The morning light streaming through the motel office windows felt different somehow, as if the events of the previous night had shifted something fundamental in the air itself. Sarah sat at the front desk, Maya sleeping peacefully in her carrier beside her, and spread out the contents of the shoebox she'd retrieved from room 7. Her hands trembled as she lifted the first photograph. A young woman with dark hair and familiar green eyes stood outside what was unmistakably the Sunset Motel, but it looked different. Fresh paint, bright neon sign, planters full of flowers. The woman wore a pale blue dress and held her hand up to shade her eyes from the sun, smiling at whoever was behind the camera. Sarah's breath caught. The resemblance was undeniable. The same jawline, the same nose, even the same habit of tilting her head slightly to the left when posed for photos. But Sarah had never seen this woman before in her life. She flipped the photograph over. In faded blue ink, someone had written Elena, summer 1987. Below that, in different handwriting, darker ink, my beautiful daughter. The word daughter hit Sarah like a physical blow. She set the photo aside with shaking hands and reached for another one. This time, it showed the same woman, Elena, sitting in what looked like the motel's office. She was holding a baby. Sarah's vision blurred as she stared at the infant in the photograph. The baby couldn't have been more than a few months old, wrapped in a yellow blanket with delicate eyelet trim. Sarah knew that blanket. She'd kept it all these years, stored in the bottom of her cedar chest, the only thing from her childhood that the social workers had let her keep when she'd been placed in foster care. The room began to spin. Sarah gripped the edge of the desk, trying to steady herself as fragments of memory flickered like old film reels in her mind. A woman's voice singing softly, the smell of jasmine, sunlight through thin curtains, images so faint they might have been dreams, but now they felt urgent, pressing against her consciousness like water against a dam. Maya stirred in her carrier, making the soft mewing sounds that meant she'd be awake soon. Sarah forced herself to breathe deeply and picked up another photograph. This one showed Elena standing next to a man Sarah didn't recognize, tall, dark-haired, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. They were both looking at something outside the frame of the photo, something that made Elena's face light up with pure joy. On the back, Elena and James, Easter 1987. "She's walking." Sarah's legs gave out and she sank into the office chair. Elena had to be her mother. The resemblance, the timeline, the yellow blanket, it all aligned with what little Sarah knew about her own history. She'd been told her mother died when she was 2, that there were no relatives to take her in. But here was evidence of a life at the Sunset Motel, evidence that someone had loved her enough to save these memories. But why had no one ever told her about this place? About Elena? Sarah reached for the next item in the box, a small leather journal with a brass clasp. Her hands shook as she opened it to the first page. Elena's handwriting was neat, careful, full of hope. March 15th, 1987. "James thinks we're crazy for buying this place, but I can see what it could become. Sarah loves it here already. She toddles around the courtyard like she owns the world. Maybe she will someday." Tears blurred Sarah's vision as she read entry after entry about her early childhood. Elena wrote about Sarah's first words, her first steps, her favorite hiding spots around the motel property. She wrote about plans to expand the business, to create a real home for her family. The entries painted a picture of a woman deeply in love with both her daughter and her new life. But as Sarah turned the pages, the tone began to change. Elena started writing about strange phone calls, about feeling watched, about James becoming increasingly paranoid and insisting they needed to leave. The final entry was dated October 31st, 1987. He found us. James was right. We should have kept running. But I thought we could make a life here. Thought Sarah could have a normal childhood. I was so foolish. If something happens to me, I pray someone will find these pictures and remember that she was loved, that we both were. The journal fell from Sarah's nerveless fingers. Maya's cries filled the silence, urgent now, demanding attention. But Sarah couldn't move, couldn't think beyond the terrible realization washing over her. Someone had been hunting her mother. Someone had found them at the Sunset Motel. And now, 35 years later, Sarah had brought her own daughter to the exact same place. The front door chimed as someone entered the office, but Sarah's eyes were still locked on Elena's final words. She'd come here seeking a fresh start, but instead she'd walked directly into the past that someone had tried very hard to erase. The manila folder felt heavier than it should have as Sarah spread its contents across the kitchen table. Emma slept peacefully in her bouncer nearby, oblivious to the storm brewing in her mother's mind. 3 documents lay before Sarah like puzzle pieces that refused to fit together properly. The birth certificate bore her name, Sarah Elizabeth Chen, born October 15th at Mercy General Hospital. Her parents listed as Michael and Linda Chen. Everything appeared normal except for one detail that made her stomach clench. The attending physician's signature was illegible, reduced to a scrawled mark that could have been anyone's name. The second document was a hospital record she'd never seen before, tucked behind the birth certificate. It showed a different story entirely. Sarah Elizabeth, female infant, found abandoned. No parents listed. Admitted October 16th, one day after her supposed birth date. The handwriting was faded, but clear enough to read the notation in the margins. Infant discovered at Sunset Motel, room 7. Appears healthy, approximately 24 hours old. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for the third paper, a photograph that had been paper-clipped to the back of the hospital record. The black and white image showed the Sunset Motel's exterior, but it looked different, newer. The paint wasn't peeling, the neon sign was intact, and cars from what appeared to be the 1990s filled the parking lot. Someone had written on the back in pencil where it all began. S.E., October 15th, 1995. Her birthday, her initials. The sound of gravel crunching outside made Sarah's heart jump. She quickly gathered the documents as footsteps approached the front door. A gentle knock followed, and through the window she could see Detective Morrison's silhouette. "Mrs. Chen? Sorry to bother you again, but I have some questions about what we found in room 7. Sarah opened the door, clutching the folder against her chest. Morrison looked tired, his usually neat appearance slightly disheveled. Behind him, she noticed a second car in the driveway, a black sedan she didn't recognize. "Is everything all right, Detective? That's what I'm trying to figure out." He glanced past her into the house. "Mind if I come in? There are some things about that hidden compartment that don't add up." Sarah stepped aside, her mind racing. Should she tell him about the documents, about the impossible coincidence of buying the very place where she might have been abandoned as a baby? Instead, she found herself asking, what kind of things? Morrison settled into the same chair he'd occupied during his previous visit, pulling out a small notebook. The construction of that compartment was professional grade, not something thrown together by an amateur. "And the timing bothers me. Our records show the motel's last owner, a man named Frank Delacroix, had some interesting connections." "What kind of connections?" "Private adoption agencies that operated in grey areas. Some legitimate, others—" He shrugged. "Let's say they asked fewer questions than they should have." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Emma stirred in her bouncer, making soft baby sounds that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. "Mrs. Chen, are you feeling all right? You look pale." "I'm fine. Just tired. She forced herself to meet his eyes. What does any of this have to do with me? Morrison studied her for a long moment. Maybe nothing. But I've learned to pay attention when coincidences pile up. You buy this specific property, you find hidden documents, and now I discover the previous owner was involved in adoptions. He paused. When were you born, Mrs. Chen? The question hit like a physical blow. Sarah's grip tightened on the folder, and she felt one corner of the photograph poking through the manila. Why would you ask that? Because one of the documents we found yesterday was dated October 1995. And there was something else in that compartment, something I didn't mention before. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an evidence bag containing a small silver bracelet, hospital identification band, too small for an adult. Sarah's legs suddenly felt weak. Through the clear plastic, she could make out tiny black letters spelling baby girl, October 15th, 1995. Detective Morrison, she began, but her voice cracked. He leaned forward, his expression shifting from professional curiosity to genuine concern. Sarah, I think there's something you're not telling me, and I'm starting to suspect there's something you don't know about your own story. The folder slipped from Sarah's grasp, spilling its contents across the coffee table. The birth certificates, the hospital record, and the photographs scattered between them like accusations waiting to be answered. Morrison's eyes widened as he took in the documents. Jesus. Where did you get these? My apartment. After my mom died. The words came out in a whisper. I thought they were just my baby papers, but now you're wondering if you were the baby found in room 7. Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. Morrison reached for the photograph, studying it carefully. Sarah, he said quietly, I think we need to have a much longer conversation. The manila envelope sat on her kitchen table like an accusation. Sarah had been staring at it for 20 minutes, while Emma slept in her carrier, the morning light creeping through the dusty windows of their makeshift apartment above the motel office. Her coffee had gone cold, but she couldn't bring herself to move. Inside the envelope were the documents she'd requested from the county clerk's office, property records for the Sunset Motel dating back to its construction in 1962. She told herself she was being practical, researching her investment, but the truth gnawed at her stomach like hunger. The photograph she'd found in room 7 showed a woman who could have been her twin, standing in front of this very building 30 years ago. The resemblance was impossible to ignore, impossible to explain. Sarah's fingers trembled as she opened the envelope and spread the papers across the scarred wooden table. Deed transfers, tax records, business licenses, the bureaucratic skeleton of the motel's history laid bare in black and white. The original owner was listed as Robert Chen, who'd operated the motel until 1987. Then the property had changed hands to someone named Marcus Webb, who'd run it until 1995 before selling to a corporation that had let it slowly decay until Sarah bought it last month. She flipped through the pages, looking for something, anything that might connect to the woman in the photograph. A previous employee, maybe, or... Her breath caught. There, on a business license renewal from 1989, was a second signature, the manager's signature. Elena Winters. Sarah's maiden name was Winters. Her father had been David Winters, a man who died when she was 3, leaving behind only fragments of memory and a box of papers her mother had always kept locked away. Papers Sarah had never been allowed to see, even after her mother's death 2 years ago. The room seemed to tilt around her. Emma stirred in her carrier, making soft sleeping sounds that usually comforted Sarah, but now felt distant, muffled by the roaring in her ears. Elena Winters. The name stared back at her from the faded carbon copy, the handwriting elegant and confident. Sarah fumbled for her purse, pulling out the photograph she'd been carrying since finding it. She studied the woman's face again, searching for differences, for proof that her mind was playing tricks on her. There were none. The sound of gravel crunching outside made her look up. Through the window, she saw a silver sedan pulling into the parking lot. the first potential customer she'd had since officially opening 3 days ago. Sarah quickly stuffed the papers back into the envelope and smoothed her hair, trying to compose herself. The man who knocked on the office door was in his 60s, well-dressed despite the early hour, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He reminded her of a professor or maybe a librarian. "Good morning," he said when she opened the door. "I was hoping you might have a room available, just for one night." "Of course," Sarah managed, grateful for the distraction. "I'm Sarah Sarah Morrison. I just bought this place." The name slip made her flush. She'd been thinking about Robert Chen from the property records. The man's expression shifted slightly, something flickering across his features too quickly to interpret. "I'm Dr. James Holloway," he said. "I used to come here years ago, actually. Beautiful spot. I was sorry to hear it had closed." Sarah led him into the small office, Emma's carrier in her arms. "You stayed here before?" "Oh yes, many times in the late 80s, early 90s. I was doing research at the university then, drove this route frequently." He paused, studying her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "Forgive me, but you look remarkably familiar. Have we met?" "I don't think so." Sarah busied herself with the registration book, an old leather-bound ledger she'd found in the office desk. "Will room 12 work for you? It has a nice view of the mountains." "Actually," Dr. Holloway said carefully, "I was hoping for room 7, if it's available." "Sentimental reasons." Sarah's pen stopped moving across the page. "Room 7? I always stayed there when I visited. The woman who managed the place back then, Elena, she always made sure it was ready for me." He was watching her closely now, his academic demeanor giving way to something more intense. "You really do look just like her, you know." "Remarkably so." The photograph felt like it was burning a hole in Sarah's pocket. Emma began to fuss, sensing her mother's tension, and Sarah bounced the carrier gently while her mind raced. "I'm sorry," she said finally, "but room 7 is undergoing renovations. Would room 6 work instead? It's identical." Dr. Holloway nodded slowly, but his eyes never left her face. "Of course. Though I have to ask, did Elena ever mention having family? A daughter, perhaps?" The question hit like a physical blow. Sarah clutched the registration book tighter, her knuckles white against the dark leather. "I wouldn't know," she whispered. "I never met anyone named Elena." But even as she said it, she wondered if that was really true. The rain had stopped by morning, but the air still hung heavy with moisture as Sarah made her way to the motel office. Emma was finally sleeping peacefully after a night of restless crying, and Sarah had seized the opportunity to tackle the growing pile of paperwork that demanded her attention. Insurance forms, permit applications, contractor estimates, the bureaucratic mountain that stood between her and a functioning business. She'd barely settled into the creaky desk chair when the bell above the front door chimed. A woman in her 60s entered, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and her clothes suggesting she'd dressed carefully for this visit. There was something familiar about her face, though Sarah couldn't place where she might have seen her before. "Are you Sarah Chen?" the woman asked, her voice carrying a slight tremor. "Yes, that's me. Can I help you?" The woman hesitated, clutching a worn leather purse against her chest. "My name is Margaret Holloway. I used to know someone who stayed here, at the motel, a long time ago." Sarah gestured to the chair across from the desk. "Please, sit down." "When was this?" Margaret perched on the edge of the chair, still gripping her purse. 1987. My daughter, Rebecca, she was staying in room 7. She was pregnant, hiding from complications in her life. She came here because she thought no one would find her." The mention of room 7 sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She kept her expression neutral, though her pulse quickened. "I'm sorry, but I only recently purchased the motel. I don't have records going back that far." "I know," Margaret said quickly. "That's not why I'm here. Rebecca left something behind when she disappeared. The previous owners never responded to my letters, but when I heard someone new had bought the place, I thought maybe..." Sarah leaned forward, Your daughter disappeared from here? Margaret's composure cracked slightly. She was supposed to call me every week. 1 week, the call never came. When I finally got the courage to drive out here myself, the room was empty. The manager said she'd checked out in the middle of the night, but Rebecca would never have left without telling me. She was scared, but she wasn't reckless. The pieces of the story settled uncomfortably in Sarah's mind. A pregnant woman. Room 7. A disappearance. She thought of the jewelry box, the baby clothes, the feeling that someone had left in a hurry. What kind of something did she leave behind? Sarah asked carefully. Margaret opened her purse and pulled out a small photograph. It showed a young woman with dark hair and kind eyes, her hand resting on a noticeably pregnant belly. She was standing in front of a car, smiling despite the worry evident in her expression. She had a music box, Margaret said. It was her grandmother's, my mother's, a small wooden box with a ballerina inside. Rebecca treasured it. She said she wanted her baby to have it someday. She'd never have left it behind willingly. Sarah's blood ran cold. The music box upstairs, the one that had played its haunting melody in the middle of the night. She forced herself to remain calm. Mrs. Holloway, did your daughter ever have the baby? I don't know. Margaret's voice broke. I hired a private investigator, filed missing person reports. Nothing. It was like she vanished into thin air. The police said she probably just wanted a fresh start somewhere else, that pregnant women sometimes did that, but they didn't know Rebecca. She wouldn't have abandoned her family. Sarah stood up abruptly. Wait here. I need to check something. She hurried up to her apartment, her heart hammering. In her bedroom, she pulled out the wooden music box and examined it more closely. On the bottom, barely visible, were the initials M.H., Margaret Holloway, or perhaps Margaret's mother. She opened the lid, and the tiny ballerina began her eternal dance to the melancholy tune. When she returned to the office, Margaret took one look at the music box and began to cry. Where did you find it? She whispered. Room 7. It was hidden in the back of a drawer. Margaret cradled the music box like it was Rebecca herself. She was here. She was really here. Mrs. Holloway, I found other things too. Baby clothes, some jewelry. But I have to ask, what was your daughter running from? Margaret's expression darkened. Her husband, David Morrison, he was violent, controlling. When Rebecca got pregnant, she thought it might change him, but it only made things worse. He didn't want the baby, said it would ruin his career, his image. When she refused to terminate the pregnancy, he threatened to make sure she never saw the child if it was born. The name hit Sarah like a physical blow. David Morrison, the same name she'd found in the motel's records, the same name that had been haunting her since she'd started digging into the motel's past. Margaret looked up at her with desperate eyes. Please, if you know anything else about what happened to Rebecca, I need to know. The fluorescent light in the motel office flickered as Sarah spread the contents of the shoebox across her desk. Emma slept peacefully in her carrier, oblivious to the storm brewing around them. Sarah's hands trembled as she picked up each photograph, studying faces that seemed both foreign and familiar. The first photo showed a young woman with Sarah's exact nose and chin, standing beside a tall man with kind eyes. The woman wore a sundress that looked like it belonged in the 1980s, her hair styled in soft waves that framed her face. On the back, someone had written Margaret and Tom, 1987, in fading blue ink. Margaret. The name felt strange on Sarah's tongue when she whispered it aloud. According to her adoption records, her birth mother's name had been Jennifer Walsh. But the woman in this photograph looked exactly like Sarah might in 30 years. Down to the small scar above her left eyebrow that Sarah had always been told came from a childhood accident she couldn't remember. The second photograph made her breath catch. The same woman, Margaret, sat in a hospital bed holding a newborn baby. The infant's face was barely visible, but Sarah could make out tiny features and a shock of dark hair. The date stamped on the border read March 15, 1995. Sarah's birthday. Her phone buzzed against the desk. Detective Morrison's name appeared on the screen. Miss Chen, I have some information about your motel's history. Can you meet me at the diner on Route 9 in an hour? Sarah looked down at Emma, then at the photographs scattered before her. I'll be there. The drive to the diner felt surreal, as if she were moving through someone else's life. The photos sat in her purse like burning coals, their implications too massive to fully process. She'd left Emma with Mrs. Rodriguez, the elderly woman who ran the flower shop next to the motel, and had become an unexpected ally since Sarah's arrival. Detective Morrison was already seated in a corner booth when she arrived, his weathered face grave. He slid a manila folder across the table as she sat down. The Sunset Motel has quite a history, he began, stirring sugar into his coffee. Between 1985 and 1998, it was owned by a couple named Margaret and Tom Winters. They ran it as a legitimate business, but there were always rumors. Sarah's pulse quickened. What kind of rumors? The kind that suggested they helped people disappear. Women, mostly. Domestic violence situations, custody disputes, witness protection cases that fell through the cracks. Nothing was ever proven, and the Winters kept to themselves. He opened the folder and pulled out a police report. In March 1995, there was a disturbance call to the motel. A woman had given birth in room 7 without medical assistance. By the time paramedics arrived, both the woman and the baby were gone. Margaret Winters claimed she'd never seen them, but neighbors reported hearing a car leave around dawn. Sarah's mouth went dry. What happened to the Winters? Tom died in 1997. Car accident on Highway 12. Margaret disappeared a year later. The motel sat empty until the bank finally sold it to a development company, who then sold it to you. Detective Morrison leaned forward, his eyes studying her face. Miss Chen, is there something you're not telling me? You've seemed on edge since the break-in, and I get the feeling this isn't just about someone ransacking your room. Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out the photographs, sliding them across the table. Morrison's eyebrows rose as he examined them. Where did you find these? Hidden in room 7, behind a loose baseboard. She pointed to the hospital photograph. That's my birthday, Detective Morrison. March 15th, 1995. And this woman looks exactly like me. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, comparing the photographs to Sarah's face. The resemblance was undeniable. Have you contacted your adoption agency? I tried. The records were sealed, and the caseworker who handled my placement died 10 years ago. I've hit dead ends everywhere I've looked. Miss Chen, if what you're suggesting is true, it means your entire adoption was arranged outside legal channels. That's a serious matter. Sarah felt tears threatening. I don't understand why someone would hide these photos in the motel. If Margaret Winters was my birth mother, if she helped arrange my adoption, why leave evidence behind? Maybe she intended to come back for them, Morrison said gently. Or maybe someone else left them there, someone who wanted them to be found eventually. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. You think someone's been watching the motel? Waiting for the right person to discover them? Before Morrison could answer, Sarah's phone rang. Mrs. Rodriguez's panicked voice filled her ear. Sarah, you need to come back right now. Someone was here asking about you and the baby. They knew your name, knew about Emma. They said they'd be back tonight. The photographs scattered to the floor as Sarah bolted from the booth, her world tilting on its axis once again. The manila envelope felt heavier than it should have as Sarah's trembling fingers worked at the clasp. Emma slept peacefully in her carrier, oblivious to the tension crackling through the air of room 7. The afternoon sun slanted through the dusty blinds, casting long shadows across the carpet where Sarah knelt beside the loose floorboard. Inside the envelope she found a stack of photographs and what appeared to be official documents. The first photograph made her breath catch. It was her mother, but younger than Sarah had ever seen her, maybe 19 or 20. She was standing outside the Sunset Motel, her hand resting protectively over a rounded belly, her face turned slightly away from the camera as if she didn't want to be photographed. Sarah's hands shook as she flipped to the next image, her mother again, this time holding a baby. The timestamp in the corner read July 1995, the month Sarah was born. But something was wrong. In every baby photo Sarah had seen of herself, she'd been in a hospital nursery or at her childhood home in Portland. She'd never seen this picture before, had never known her mother had brought her here, to this place. The documents underneath told a story that made her stomach lurch. A birth certificate with the Sunset Motel's address listed as place of birth. Not the hospital in Portland like she'd always been told. Medical records showing her mother had given birth here in room 7 with only a midwife present. And at the bottom of the stack, a letter in her mother's handwriting dated just weeks before her death 3 years ago. "My dearest Sarah," the letter began, and Sarah's vision blurred with tears she hadn't expected. "If you're reading this, then you've found your way back to where your story truly began. I know I should have told you the truth, but some secrets feel too dangerous to speak aloud, even to those we love most." Sarah wiped her eyes and continued reading, her mother's familiar script swimming before her. "I was young and scared when I came to the Sunset Motel. Your father, not the man who raised you, but your biological father, he brought me here. Told me it was temporary, that we'd figure everything out. But he disappeared 3 days before you were born, and I never saw him again. The woman who owned this place then, Margaret Chen, she helped deliver you. She was kind to us when no one else would be." The name Chen rang a bell. Sarah remembered the previous owner Mr. Hendricks had mentioned when she'd bought the property. Margaret Chen had owned the motel for decades before selling it to a development company that went bankrupt. "There are things about your father that I never told you. Things that might put you in danger if the wrong people knew where to find you. He wasn't just anyone, Sarah. He was involved with some very bad people. People who wouldn't hesitate to hurt an innocent child if they thought it would give them leverage. So I took you far away, changed our story, and built us a new life. I thought the past would stay buried." Sarah's pulse hammered in her ears. She glanced at Emma, sleeping so peacefully, and felt a fierce protectiveness surge through her chest. "But now that I'm gone, and if you've found your way back there, maybe it's time you knew the truth. There's a safety deposit box at First National Bank in Portland, box 347. The key is hidden behind the loose brick in our old fireplace, the third one from the left on the bottom row. Inside that box you'll find everything else. Photos of your father, information about what he was involved in, and proof of things I couldn't bear to tell you while I was alive." The letter trembled in Sarah's hands. Her entire life had been built on a lie, not a malicious one, but a lie meant to protect her. And now she'd unknowingly brought Emma to the very place her mother had tried so hard to escape. "I love you more than words can say, and everything I did was to keep you safe. But if you're reading this, it means you're strong enough to handle the truth. Trust your instincts. Trust your heart, and remember that sometimes the greatest courage is knowing when to run." The letter was signed simply, Mom, with a small heart drawn beside it. Sarah sat back on her heels, her mind reeling. The strange incidents at the motel, the car that had circled the parking lot, the man asking questions in town, Detective Morrison's interest in room 7, suddenly took on a sinister new meaning. Had someone figured out she was here? Did they know who she was? Emma stirred in her carrier, making small suckling sounds in her sleep. Sarah looked at her daughter's innocent face and felt the weight of history pressing down on them both. Whatever her father had been involved in 28 years ago, whatever had sent her mother running, it felt like the past was catching up to them. She gathered the photographs and documents, her hands steadier now despite the chaos in her mind. She needed answers, and she knew exactly where to start looking. The photograph trembled in Sarah's hands as she stared at the woman who looked exactly like her. Behind the stranger stood a younger version of the man she'd always called her father, his arm wrapped protectively around the woman's shoulders. The date scrawled on the back read, June 1985, exactly 9 months before Sarah was born. Emma stirred in her crib, letting out a soft whimper that pulled Sarah back to the present. She set the photograph on the nightstand and lifted her daughter, holding her close while her mind raced. The woman in the picture had Sarah's eyes, her nose, even the same stubborn cowlick that refused to be tamed. There was no denying the resemblance. "Who was she, baby girl?" Sarah whispered into Emma's downy hair. "And why didn't anyone ever tell me about her?" The next morning brought no answers, only more questions. Sarah had barely slept, spending most of the night staring at the ceiling while fragments of memories tried to surface, conversations that stopped when she entered rooms, her father's distant looks on certain anniversaries, her grandmother's cryptic comments about things better left buried. Detective Morrison arrived at 10, looking more haggard than usual. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his normally pressed shirt was wrinkled. He accepted the coffee Sarah offered with grateful hands. "Any word on the dental records?" she asked, settling across from him at the small kitchen table she'd salvaged from one of the rooms. "That's actually why I'm here." Morrison took a long sip before continuing. The victim's name was Linda Chambers, 23 years old when she disappeared in January 1986. She'd been working as a waitress at a diner about 50 miles east of here. Sarah's stomach clenched. "January 1986. I was born in March of that year." I noticed the timing. Morrison studied her face carefully. "There's more. Linda had a baby, a daughter born the previous March. The child went missing the same time Linda disappeared. The birth certificate lists the father as unknown." Morrison leaned forward. "Sarah, I need to ask you some difficult questions about your adoption." "I wasn't adopted." The words came out automatically, a truth she'd never questioned, but even as she said them, doubt crept in. "My parents never. They would have told me." Morrison pulled out a manila folder and extracted several documents. "These are Linda's missing person reports and her daughter's birth certificate. The baby's name was Sarah Chambers." The room tilted sideways. Sarah gripped the edge of the table, fighting waves of nausea. Everything she thought she knew about herself was crumbling. Her childhood, her identity, her very name, all of it built on lies. "The man in the investigation files," she managed to say. "Do you have his name?" "Robert Hayes. He was Linda's boyfriend and the prime suspect in her disappearance, but there wasn't enough evidence to charge him." Morrison paused. "Sarah, what was your father's name? Your adoptive father?" "Robert Coleman." But even as she said it, Sarah remembered something else. Late one night when she was 12, she'd overheard her parents arguing. Her mother had called him Bobby, a nickname he'd always claimed to hate. And there had been something else, something about papers and making sure nobody ever found out. "I need to see more pictures," Sarah said suddenly. "Do you have any of Robert Hayes?" Morrison hesitated before sliding another photograph across the table. It was a police mugshot from 1987. Robert Hayes, arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct. The man staring back at her was definitely her father, just 20 years younger and wearing a different name. The implications hit her like a physical blow. Her father hadn't just known about the woman in room 7, he had killed her. And then he'd taken her baby, taken Sarah, and built a new life hundreds of miles away. "He saved me," she whispered, then immediately felt sick for the thought. How could she think of it as saving when he'd murdered her mother? "Sarah, I need you to think carefully. Did your father ever mention this place? Any connection to the motel or this area?" She shook her head, then stopped. "Wait, there was something. When I told him I was buying this place, he got upset, really upset. He said I was making a mistake, that I should look somewhere else. I thought he was just being overprotective." Morrison made notes in his small pad. "We're going to need DNA confirmation, but given the evidence, I think we can safely say you're Linda Chambers' daughter." Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, matching the turmoil in Sarah's chest. She looked down at Emma, sleeping peacefully in her arms, and wondered what other secrets were buried in the walls of the Sunset Motel. The lockbox key felt cold against Sarah's palm as she stood before room 7's door. Emma slept peacefully in her carrier, oblivious to the weight of what her mother was about to uncover. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the motel's courtyard, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked intermittently. Sarah's hands trembled as she inserted the key. The lock turned with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting all these years for this moment. The door swung open with a prolonged creak that seemed to echo her racing heartbeat. The room was frozen in time. Unlike the other units she'd been renovating, this one remained untouched by decay. A thin layer of dust covered everything, but beneath it, the space felt preserved, almost sacred. The bed was neatly made with a faded floral comforter. A small suitcase sat open on the dresser, clothes still folded inside, as if someone had simply stepped out for a moment. But it was the photographs scattered across the nightstand that made Sarah's breath catch. She recognized her own face staring back from dozens of pictures. Not recent photos, but images from her childhood that she'd never seen before. There she was at maybe 5 years old, building a sandcastle on a beach she couldn't remember visiting. Another showed her sleeping in what looked like this very room, sunlight streaming across her small form. Sarah sank onto the bed, Emma's carrier beside her. Her fingers traced the edges of the photographs with growing confusion. In several pictures, a woman sat next to her, someone with Sarah's same dark hair and green eyes, but a face that should have been familiar yet felt like a stranger's. A leather journal lay beneath the photos. Sarah opened it with shaking hands, recognizing her own name written in unfamiliar handwriting on the first page. The entries began 28 years ago. Sarah took her first steps today in the courtyard. She's so determined, gets right back up every time she falls. She has her father's stubborn streak. Sarah's vision blurred. According to her birth certificate, she'd been born in Portland. Her adoptive parents had told her that her birth mother died in childbirth, that there were no other relatives. They'd raised her with love, but always maintained that her origins were a closed book. She flipped through more pages, each entry a window into a childhood she'd supposedly never lived. Stories of feeding ducks by a nearby pond, of afternoon naps in room 7, of a mother who clearly adored her daughter, but seemed to be hiding from something. Had to move again. Someone was asking questions in town. Sarah doesn't understand why we can't stay, but she's adaptable. Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing the right thing, keeping her here, but it's the only way to keep her safe. Safe from what? Sarah's mind raced as she continued reading. The entries spoke of a father who couldn't know about Sarah's existence, of people who might come looking, of a love affair that had dangerous consequences. Emma stirred in her carrier, making soft baby sounds that brought Sarah back to the present moment. She looked down at her daughter and felt a chill of recognition. Was history repeating itself? Was she, like this mysterious woman, raising her child in hiding? A manila envelope tucked behind the journal contained official documents that made Sarah's head spin. A birth certificate with her name, but listing this address and different parents than she'd ever known. Immigration papers for someone named Elena Vasquez. And most disturbing of all, a death certificate for Sarah Martinez, dated when she would have been 6 years old. Sarah's hands shook as she pieced together the implications. Someone had given her a new identity, erased her first 6 years of life, and placed her with the family she'd always believed were her adoptive parents. But why? And who was Elena Vasquez? A loose floorboard creaked beneath her feet as she stood to examine more of the room. Kneeling down, she discovered it wasn't just loose, it was deliberately removable. Underneath lay a metal box containing cash, more fake identification documents, and a loaded revolver that made her stomach lurch. The final item in the box was a letter addressed to "My darling Sarah" in the same handwriting as the journal. Sarah's hands trembled as she unfolded it. If you're reading this, then something has happened to me and you've somehow found your way back to the Sunset Motel. I pray that means you're safe and grown, but I fear it might mean you're in danger. The man who is your father is not someone who can ever know you exist. He's powerful and ruthless, and he would use you to hurt me or worse. I've given you a new life, a clean slate, but if you're here now, that slate might not be as clean as I hoped. Emma began to fuss, hungry and needing attention, but Sarah couldn't move. Everything she'd thought she knew about herself was crumbling, replaced by questions that felt more dangerous than comforting. Outside, a car engine rumbled closer, then stopped in the parking lot. The photograph trembled in Sarah's hands as she stared at the image that couldn't possibly exist. There she was, maybe 4 years old, standing beside a woman who looked exactly like her mother, but wearing clothes from decades before Sarah was born. The motel in the background was unmistakable. The sunset, but newer, brighter, with fresh paint and hope still clinging to its walls. "This doesn't make sense," she whispered, her voice barely audible over Emma's soft breathing from the crib. The baby had finally fallen asleep after hours of fussing, as if she too could sense the wrongness that had settled over their new home like fog. Sarah's hands shook as she reached for her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found her mother's number. 3 rings, 4, then voicemail, of course. Margaret Chen had always been elusive when Sarah needed answers most. The floorboard creaked behind her, and Sarah spun around, her heart hammering. Nothing, just shadows playing tricks in the dim light from the single lamp. But the air felt different now, charged with an electricity that made the hair on her arms stand up. She looked down at the photograph again, studying every detail. The woman's face was definitely her mother's, the same sharp cheekbones, the same knowing smile, but the clothes, the hairstyle, even the quality of the photograph suggested it was taken in the 1960s, maybe earlier. Her mother would have been a child then, not the young woman in the picture. A memory surfaced, unbidden. Sarah was 12, rifling through her mother's jewelry box while Margaret was at work. Hidden beneath the velvet lining, she'd found a birth certificate, not hers but her mother's. The date had seemed wrong then, but when she'd asked about it later, Margaret had laughed it off, claiming it was a clerical error that she'd never bothered to fix. But what if it wasn't an error? Sarah set the photograph on the dresser and began searching the room more systematically. Behind the loose baseboard, she found more items: a room key with the number 7 stamped in faded gold, a newspaper clipping from 1967 about a missing girl named Margaret Winters, and a small leather journal bound with a rubber band. Her fingers fumbled with the band as she opened the journal. The handwriting inside was familiar, the same careful cursive her mother had taught her to write. Day 1, the machine worked. "I'm here, but everything is wrong. The motel exists, but it's different. Older. I need to find a way back." Day 15, met a man named Robert Chen today. He's kind, reminds me of someone I knew before. Maybe staying wouldn't be so terrible. Day 67, I'm pregnant. The machine's effects must be more extensive than I thought. What have I done to my child? Day 100, I've decided to stay. Going back would mean leaving Sarah, and I can't do that. But I have to hide the truth. If anyone finds out what I really am, what I've done. The journal slipped from Sarah's nerveless fingers, pages fluttering as it hit the floor. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. What I really am. The dates in the journal spanned several months in 1987, the year Sarah was born. A sound from downstairs made her freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the lobby. Sarah grabbed the photograph and journal, stuffing them into her jacket pocket before carefully lifting Emma from the crib. The baby stirred but didn't wake. The footsteps were on the stairs now, coming closer. Sarah pressed herself against the wall beside the door, holding her breath. Through the thin wood, she could hear someone moving in the hallway, checking each room methodically. Room 4, empty. Room 5, empty. Room 6. The footsteps paused. Sarah's mind raced. The back stairs. There was a service entrance behind the motel that led to a narrow staircase she'd noticed during her initial inspection. If she could make it to the bathroom window, she might be able to climb out onto the roof and reach those stairs. The doorknob to room 7 turned slowly. Sarah didn't wait to see who entered. She slipped into the bathroom, easing the window open as quietly as possible. The night air hit her face like a slap, cold and sharp. Behind her, she heard the bedroom door creak open. "Sarah?" The voice was familiar, warm, concerned. her mother's voice. But that was impossible. Margaret was 300 miles away in Portland, had been for weeks. Unless, I know you're here, sweetheart. We need to talk about what you've found. Sarah hesitated, one leg already through the window. The voice was exactly right, every inflection perfect. But something underneath it felt wrong, like an actor who'd memorized the lines but couldn't quite capture the emotion. Emma stirred in her arms, making a small sound that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. Sarah, please, let me explain about the photograph, about everything. The voice was closer now, just outside the bathroom door. Sarah made her choice, pulling herself and Emma through the window onto the slippery roof tiles, praying they would hold her weight as she crawled toward freedom and answers that might destroy everything she thought she knew about herself. The manila envelope felt heavier than it should have, as Sarah clutched it against her chest, Emma sleeping peacefully in her carrier beside the kitchen table. Detective Morrison had left 20 minutes ago, but his words still echoed in her mind. Sometimes the truth is worse than the mystery. With trembling fingers, she opened the envelope and spread the contents across the scratched formica surface. Crime scene photographs, police reports, witness statements, all dated 27 years ago. Her breath caught as she recognized the familiar layout of the motel in the black and white photos, though it looked different then, newer, with a painted sign that read, Sunset Paradise Motor Lodge. The first photograph showed Room 7's door standing ajar, yellow police tape stretched across the frame. The second made her stomach lurch, a woman's body on the bed, dark hair fanned across blood-soaked pillows. Sarah forced herself to look closer at the victim's face, searching for some resemblance to herself, some answer to the questions that had been building since she first stepped into that cursed room. The police report identified the victim as Lisa Chen, 22 years old, a college student who had been staying at the motel for 3 days before her murder. Sarah scanned the details, multiple stab wounds, no signs of forced entry, no witnesses. The case had gone cold within months. But it was the witness statement that made Sarah's blood freeze. A motel guest in room 5 had reported seeing a pregnant woman arguing with Lisa Chen on the night of the murder. The witness described the woman as having long blonde hair and wearing a blue coat. Sarah's mother had been blonde. Sarah had been born just 2 months after Lisa Chen's death. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found her adoptive father's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm and familiar. Sarah, sweetheart, how are you settling in? Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Her voice cracked slightly. About my adoption, about where I came from. The silence stretched too long. She could hear him breathing, could almost feel his internal struggle through the phone. What's brought this on, honey? I found something. About the motel, about what happened here before I was born. She stared at the crime scene photo. There was a murder, Dad, and the timing, it matches exactly with when you and Mom adopted me. Another pause. Then, quietly, where are you? I'm coming over. Just tell me now, please. She heard him sigh, a sound heavy with years of kept secrets. Your mother, your biological mother, she wasn't ready to be a parent. She was young, scared, and she'd gotten herself into some trouble. That's all we knew when the adoption agency connected us. What kind of trouble? Sarah, what kind of trouble, Dad? The kind that meant she couldn't keep you safe. The kind that meant giving you to us was the only way to protect you. His voice was strained now. We never asked for details. We just knew that a scared young woman needed her baby to disappear, to have a completely new life where no one could connect you to her past. Sarah's vision blurred as the pieces began forming a horrifying picture. She was running from something, or someone. We gave you love, Sarah. We gave you safety. Whatever happened before you came to us, it doesn't change that. But Sarah barely heard him. She was staring at another document in the pile, a forensics report about DNA evidence found at the scene. Most of it had been too degraded to process with the technology available in 1996. but it had been preserved. Morrison had included a sticky note. Current technology might yield results. Could run against databases if you want answers. The baby monitor crackled, and Emma's soft cries filled the kitchen. Sarah looked at her daughter's innocent face through the carrier's mesh window and felt a chill run through her. What if the violence that had happened in room 7 was connected to her family? What if bringing Emma here had put her own child in danger? "Dad, I have to go." Emma's crying. "Sarah, wait. Don't do anything rash. Some stones are better left unturned." But she had already hung up. She gathered the documents back into the envelope, her mind racing. The DNA evidence could provide answers, but it might also confirm her worst fears. If her biological mother had been involved in Lisa Chen's murder, if she was the product of violence or crime, what did that mean for Emma's future? The sound of gravel crunching outside made her freeze. Through the kitchen window, she saw a dark sedan pulling into the motel parking lot, its headlights cutting through the growing dusk. The car stopped directly in front of room 7, and a figure emerged from the driver's side, tall, wearing a baseball cap, pulled low over their face. Sarah's heart hammered as the figure approached the room's door, producing what looked like a key from their pocket. Someone else had access to room 7, someone who knew she'd been digging into the past. The photograph trembled in Sarah's hands as she stared at the impossible image before her. A younger version of her mother stood beside a man Sarah had never seen before, both of them laughing in front of the very motel she now owned. The timestamp on the back read 1989, 3 years before Sarah was born. "That's not possible," she whispered, her voice barely audible over Emma's soft breathing from the crib nearby. "She told me she'd never been here before." Detective Morrison leaned forward, studying the photo over her shoulder. "Sometimes people have reasons for rewriting their own history, Sarah. The question is why your mother felt the need to lie about this place." Sarah's mind raced through decades of conversations with her mother, searching for any hint, any crack in the story she'd been told about her childhood. Her mother had always been vague about the years before Sarah's birth, claiming they lived quietly in Oregon, that Sarah's father had left when she was a baby. But here was proof that her mother had not only been to Sunset Falls, but had seemed happy here, intimate with someone Sarah had never heard of. "The man in the photo," she said, turning it over to examine every detail. "Do you recognize him?" Morrison squinted at the faded image. "Something familiar about him, but I can't place it. This was taken before my time here. We could ask Chief Williams. He's been around since the 70s. A sudden chill ran down Sarah's spine as she remembered the locked drawer in the motel office, the one she'd never managed to open. Her mother had always carried a small key on her keychain, claiming it was for an old jewelry box that had been lost years ago. But what if it wasn't lost? What if it had been here all along? "I need to check something," she said, carefully placing the photograph in her jacket pocket. "Can you stay with Emma for a few minutes?" Morrison nodded, settling into the chair beside the crib. "Take your time. I'll keep watch." Sarah hurried through the connecting door to the office, her heart pounding with each step. The old desk sat exactly where it had for decades, its bottom drawer still stubbornly locked. She pulled out her mother's keychain, hands shaking as she isolated the small brass key she'd carried for years without understanding its purpose. The key slid into the lock with a soft click. Inside the drawer, Sarah found a collection of items that painted a picture of a life her mother had hidden from her completely. More photographs showed her mother at various ages, always with the same mysterious man, their relationship clearly romantic and long-lasting. There were love letters signed with the initial M, describing plans for a future together, dreams of opening a family business, hopes for children. At the bottom of the drawer, Sarah's fingers closed around a small velvet box. Inside, she found a wedding ring, simple gold, well-worn, and a marriage certificate that made her knees buckle. Margaret Ellen Thompson married Michael James Sterling on June 15, 1988, in Sunset Falls, Nevada. Her mother had been married, here at this motel, to a man named Michael Sterling. Sarah sank into the desk chair, the certificate clutched in her trembling hands. Everything she thought she knew about her origins, her family, her mother's past, crumbled around her like the deteriorating walls of the motel itself. Who was Michael Sterling? What had happened to him? And why had her mother chosen to erase him so completely from their history? A sound from the main room drew her attention. Emma crying and Morrison's gentle voice trying to soothe her. Sarah quickly gathered the photographs and documents, her mind spinning with questions that demanded answers. She thought about the blood in room 7, the missing person reports from 1991, the way her mother's face had changed whenever anyone mentioned their family history. As she locked the drawer again, Sarah noticed something else. A small appointment book from 1991, the year that kept appearing in all the police reports. She flipped to the final entries, written in her mother's familiar handwriting. The last entry, dated October 15th, 1991, contained just 3 words: "He found us." The blood drained from Sarah's face as the implications hit her. Her mother hadn't just lived here, she'd been running from something or someone, and whatever had happened in 1991 had been serious enough to make her flee, to change their entire identity, to spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder. Sarah returned to the main room, where Morrison was successfully calming Emma with practiced ease. He looked up as she entered, immediately noticing her pale complexion. "What did you find?" Sarah held up the marriage certificate with a shaky hand. "My mother was married here, to someone named Michael Sterling, and I think whatever happened to him is connected to room 7. Morrison's expression darkened as he recognized the name. Michael Sterling. That's why the man in the photo looked familiar. He met Sarah's eyes with grim certainty. He's been missing since October 1991. His disappearance was never solved. The photograph trembled in Sarah's hands as the pieces of her fractured past finally clicked into place. The woman in the faded image wasn't just any stranger. It was her mother, Rebecca, 25 years younger, standing beside a man Sarah had never seen before. Behind them loomed the familiar outline of the Sunset Motel, looking vibrant and welcoming instead of the decrepit shell she'd purchased. "My mother was here," she whispered, her voice barely audible over Emma's soft breathing from the carrier. "She was actually here." Detective Martinez leaned closer, studying the photograph with professional intensity. "When do you think this was taken?" Sarah flipped the photo over, finding her mother's familiar handwriting in faded blue ink, R&J, summer 1998, our beginning. Her heart lurched. 1998, the year before Sarah was born, the year her mother had vanished for 6 months, claiming later she'd been visiting a sick aunt in Oregon. "She lied to me," Sarah said, the betrayal cutting deeper than she'd expected. All those years she made up stories about that summer. But she was here, at this motel, with someone named Jay. Martinez's radio crackled to life, interrupting her spiraling thoughts. The forensics team had finished processing room 7, and their preliminary findings were disturbing. Traces of blood had been found beneath layers of old carpet, and the pattern suggested something violent had occurred there decades ago. Sarah's legs gave way, and she sank onto the motel office's worn couch. Everything she thought she knew about her origins was crumbling. Her mother had always been evasive about Sarah's father, claiming he was a brief relationship that ended badly. But now, staring at the photograph of her mother's radiant smile next to this mysterious man, Sarah wondered if her entire life had been built on lies. "We need to run DNA tests on the blood samples," Martinez said gently. "And I think you should consider the possibility that your mother's connection to this place might be more significant than we initially thought." The office door chimed as Dr. Chen entered, her expression grave. She'd been consulting on the case since the discovery of the skeletal remains, and Sarah had grown to trust her quiet expertise. "I've finished my preliminary examination of the remains from room 7, Dr. Chen announced. The victim was a male, approximately 30 years old at time of death. Based on the condition of the bones and the items found with the body, I'd estimate death occurred sometime in the late 1990s. Sarah's blood turned to ice, the same time frame as the photograph, the same period when her mother had mysteriously disappeared for 6 months, only to return pregnant and refused to discuss where she'd been or who Sarah's father was. "There's something else," Dr. Chen continued, pulling out a sealed evidence bag. "We found this ring on the victim's finger. It's engraved with the initials JM. Through the clear plastic, Sarah could see a simple gold band, tarnished with age, but still bearing the clear markings. JM, the man in the photograph with her mother, had been identified simply as J. Martinez was already on her phone, calling in requests to run the ring through missing persons databases. But Sarah barely heard the conversation. Her mind was reeling with implications she didn't want to face. Had her mother been involved in whatever happened in room 7? Was the skeleton the remains of her biological father? The questions multiplied faster than she could process them, each one more horrifying than the last. Emma stirred in her carrier, making soft cooing sounds that normally would have comforted Sarah. Instead, she felt a crushing weight of responsibility. What kind of legacy had she inherited? What kind of place had she brought her innocent daughter to? "Sarah," Martinez said softly, ending her call, "I need to ask you some difficult questions about your mother, about what she might have told you about that summer, about your father, about anything that might help us understand what happened here." But Sarah was staring out the window at room 7, its yellow police tape fluttering in the evening breeze like warning flags. In the fading light, she could almost imagine the motel as it had been in 1998. Fresh paint, working neon signs, young couples like her mother and the mysterious Jay checking in for what they thought would be romantic getaways. Instead, at least one of them had never checked out. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Stop digging, or you'll end up like him." Sarah's hands shook as she showed the message to Martinez, who immediately began tracing the number. But Sarah knew with cold certainty that whoever had sent it was still out there, still watching, still protecting whatever secret had turned the Sunset Motel into a graveyard. And somehow, her mother had been part of it all. The photograph trembled in Sarah's hands as the pieces finally clicked into place. The woman in the faded image wasn't just someone who looked like her. It was her mother, Margaret, 25 years younger, standing outside this very motel with a man Sarah now recognized from the missing person reports scattered across Detective Morrison's desk. "Thomas Whitmore," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the cramped office space. "He was here with my mother." Detective Morrison leaned forward, his weathered face grave. "Sarah, there's something else you need to know. We found Margaret's journal hidden in the wall cavity behind the reception desk. She wrote about Thomas, about what they discovered here." The baby stirred in Sarah's arms, sensing her tension. She adjusted Emma's blanket with shaking hands, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy even as her world crumbled around her. What did she discover? Morrison opened a plastic evidence bag and carefully extracted a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. "According to this, your mother and Thomas were investigating a series of disappearances connected to the motel. People would check into room 7 and simply vanish. The former owner, Vincent Carrera, was running something far worse than a simple roadside inn." Sarah's stomach lurched. "What kind of something?" "Human trafficking," Morrison said quietly. "Room 7 was a way station. People were brought there, held, and then moved along a pipeline that stretched across 3 states. Your mother stumbled onto it when she was working as a social worker, following up on missing persons cases." The room seemed to spin around Sarah. Her mother had never mentioned working in this area, never spoken of any motel or investigation. Why didn't she go to the police? She tried, but Carrera had connections, people in law enforcement who were being paid to look the other way. According to the journal, your mother and Thomas were gathering evidence, building a case they could take to federal authorities. Morrison's voice grew heavier. They never got the chance. Sarah thought of the scratches on the walls of room 7, the desperate messages carved into wood and plaster. How many people had been trapped there, waiting for rescue that never came? What happened to them? The journal ends abruptly in March 1998. The last entry mentions a meeting with someone who claimed to have more information about the operation. Margaret wrote that she was scared, but she couldn't stop. Too many lives were at stake. March 1998. Sarah's mind raced, calculating dates. That was 3 months before her mother had suddenly moved them across the state, claiming she'd found a better job. 3 months before Margaret had become withdrawn, constantly looking over her shoulder, jumping at every unexpected sound. My mother escaped, Sarah realized. But Thomas didn't. Morrison nodded grimly. We found his remains this morning, buried in the desert about 2 miles from here. Coroner estimates he's been dead approximately 20 to 5 years. The weight of revelation pressed down on Sarah's chest. Her entire childhood had been built on a lie. Her mother's paranoia, her insistence on keeping a low profile, the way she'd changed the subject whenever anyone asked about their past. It all made terrible sense now. Carrera's been dead for 15 years, Morrison continued. Heart attack, according to records. But that doesn't mean the operation ended with him. These things have a way of continuing, evolving. Sarah looked around the office that had become her sanctuary, now feeling like a tomb filled with ghosts. Is that why someone's been watching me? Because they think I know something? Possibly. Or because they're afraid you'll discover what your mother found. There could still be people involved who have a lot to lose if the truth comes out. Emma began to fuss, her small fists waving in the air. Sarah stood, pacing the small space as she tried to process everything. I bought this place by accident. I had no idea about any of this. Sometimes the past has a way of finding us, Morrison said softly. The question is, what do you want to do now? We can arrange protection, help you relocate. No, the word came out sharper than Sarah intended. She looked down at her daughter, then back at the detective. My mother ran, and she spent the rest of her life looking over her shoulder. I won't do that to Emma. I won't let these people win. Morrison studied her face. What are you thinking? I'm thinking it's time to finish what my mother started, she said, her voice steady with newfound resolve. Whatever it takes. The rain hammered against the motel office windows as Sarah stared at the photograph in her trembling hands. The faded image showed a young woman who looked exactly like her, standing beside a man in a sheriff's uniform outside the very room where Sarah had found the hidden compartment. On the back, someone had written Elena Vasquez, 1994, in careful script. That's impossible, she whispered. But Detective Morrison's grim expression told her otherwise. We ran the dental records from the remains in room 7, he said quietly. Sarah, the woman buried beneath that floor was your mother. The photograph slipped from her fingers, fluttering to the desk like a dying butterfly. Sarah's legs gave out, and she sank into the chair behind her, her mind reeling. My mother died in a car accident when I was 3. My father told me. Your father lied. Morrison pulled up a chair across from her. Elena Vasquez disappeared in 1994. She was 22 years old, worked as a housekeeper here at the Sunset Motel. According to missing person reports, she had a 3-year-old daughter. The room spun around Sarah. Every memory she had of her childhood felt like it was crumbling, each certainty dissolving like sugar in rain. The man in the photograph. Who is he? Morrison hesitated. Former Sheriff Daniel Cross. He owned this motel back then, ran it as a side business. The investigation shows he was having an affair with your mother. Sarah's hands instinctively moved to her stomach, where Emma slept peacefully in her carrier. The parallel wasn't lost on her. Another young mother, another powerful man, another secret that someone was willing to kill for. There's more. Morrison pulled out a manila folder. We found Elena's journal hidden in that compartment along with the other evidence. She wrote about being pregnant. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Pregnant? But I was already born in 1991. She was pregnant again, with Sheriff Cross's child. She was planning to expose their affair and demand he leave his wife. The last entry is dated 3 days before she disappeared. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to process the magnitude of what she was learning. So she was murdered to keep the secret. That's what we believe. Cross had everything to lose, his marriage, his career, his reputation. Elena was a threat he couldn't control. Morrison leaned forward. "Sarah, there's something else. We think your father knew." "What do you mean?" "Thomas Chen wasn't your biological father, but he was Elena's friend. The timing suggests he helped cover up her disappearance, possibly even helped bury her. In exchange, he got to raise you as his own daughter." The office door chimed, and Sarah looked up to see her father walking in from the rain, his face pale and drawn. He stopped when he saw Morrison, his eyes darting between the detective and Sarah. "Tommy," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "Is it true?" Her father's shoulders sagged, decades of buried guilt finally surfacing. He nodded slowly, unable to meet her eyes. "I never meant for you to find out like this. You've known all along that my mother was murdered and buried under this motel?" Sarah's voice cracked. "You let me buy this place, let me bring Emma here, knowing what happened. I hoped the secret would stay buried. Cross has been dead for 5 years. I thought it was over." Thomas sat down heavily, looking every one of his 73 years. "Your mother came to me the night before she died. She was terrified," said Cross had threatened her. "She begged me to take care of you if anything happened. So you just let everyone believe she abandoned me?" It was better than the truth. Cross was powerful, had connections everywhere. If I'd tried to expose him, then we both would have ended up dead, and you would have had no one. Sarah felt a cold rage building in her chest. "You stole my right to know who I really am. You stole my mother's right to justice." Morrison cleared his throat. "There's one more thing. The DNA results came back on the remains of the infant found with Elena." Sarah's breath caught. "And it was a boy, your half-brother, Cross's son." The rain continued its relentless assault on the windows as Sarah tried to comprehend the full scope of the tragedy. Her mother hadn't just been murdered, she'd been killed while trying to protect her unborn child, while fighting for a future that would never come. "Where is Cross buried?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Morrison looked surprised. "Hillview Cemetery. Why?" Sarah stood up, her decision crystallizing like ice. "Because it's time someone told my mother's story, all of it, and I'm going to make sure the whole town knows what kind of man they had protecting them. The truth would finally see daylight, even if it destroyed everything Sarah thought she knew about her life." The police cars were gone by morning, their red and blue lights no longer painting the motel walls in urgent colors. Sarah sat on the front steps, Emma sleeping peacefully in her arms, watching the sun rise over what had been her sanctuary and her prison. Detective Morrison approached with 2 steaming cups of coffee, settling beside her with a weary sigh. "Forensics found everything we need in the hidden room. Photos, documents, jewelry from dozens of victims spanning 20 years. Your father was methodical." Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the bitter warmth. "He wasn't my father." The words felt strange on her tongue, but somehow right. Not in any way that mattered. "The DNA results will take a few days, but given what we found..." Morrison gestured toward room 7, where crime scene tape still fluttered in the morning breeze. "There's a good chance you'll finally know who you really are." Through the investigation, they'd discovered a box of identification documents belonging to families who had stayed at the motel and never left. Among them was a birth certificate for a baby girl named Emma Claire Hoffman, born 3 days before Sarah's supposed birthday. The photograph tucked behind it showed a young woman with Sarah's eyes and Emma's button nose. "The Hoffman case," Morrison continued, "was one of the first cold cases I worked as a rookie. Young couple, traveling cross-country with their infant daughter. Car found abandoned 50 miles from here, family vanished without a trace." He paused, studying Sarah's profile. "You were probably too young to remember them. Your real parents." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to summon any fragment of memory from before Frank Whitmore became her world. Sometimes she thought she could almost grasp something, the scent of lavender, gentle humming, arms that held her without leaving bruises. But it might have been wishful thinking. "What happens now?" she asked. "Whitmore will never hurt anyone again. The families of his victims will finally have answers, closure. As for you, Morrison stood, brushing dust from his pants. That's your choice. You could sell this place. Take Emma somewhere fresh. Start over properly this time. But as Sarah looked across the motel courtyard, she realized she didn't want to run anymore. The horror hidden in room 7 was gone, exorcised by truth and justice. What remained was something she had built with her own hands, a home, a business, a life. The ghosts that had haunted these rooms were finally at peace. "No," she said firmly. "We're staying." Morrison smiled. "I had a feeling you'd say that. The state will probably compensate you for what you've been through, and there might be inheritance money from the Hoffman estate if they were your parents. You could renovate, expand, really make this place something special." Emma stirred in Sarah's arms, opening her bright blue eyes to blink at the morning sun. Sarah kissed her daughter's forehead, breathing in that sweet baby scent that meant everything good in the world. "I want to change the name," Sarah said suddenly. "Something that honors the people who died here, but also looks toward the future." "What did you have in mind?" Sarah gazed at the rising sun painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and pink. New Dawn Motel, for second chances. Over the following weeks, Sarah threw herself into transformation. She had room 7 completely gutted and rebuilt, turning it into a bright family suite with cheerful yellow walls and windows that let in floods of natural light. The hidden room was sealed forever, its secrets finally exposed to the cleansing power of truth. Travelers began stopping again, drawn by fresh paint, updated amenities, and Sarah's genuine warmth. She hired Maria, a local woman whose gentle nature with Emma made the choice easy. Together, they created the kind of place Sarah had always dreamed of, somewhere people could rest safely on their journeys. The DNA results confirmed what they had suspected. Emma Claire Hoffman had become Sarah Whitmore, raised by her parents' killer in a twisted mockery of family. But knowing the truth didn't diminish who she had chosen to become. If anything, it strengthened her resolve to build something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. Standing in the motel office one evening, Emma babbling happily in her playpen, while Sarah updated the guest registry, she felt the weight of the past finally lifting. The woman in the faded photograph had been her mother, but Sarah would be Emma's mother. The cycle of violence and secrets ended here. Through the window, she watched guests arriving for the night. A young couple holding hands, an elderly man stretching after long hours of driving, a family with children chasing each other around the parking lot, their laughter echoing off the desert hills. Room 7's light glowed warmly, no longer harboring nightmares but offering sanctuary to weary travelers. Like Sarah herself, the Sunset Motel had been reborn as something better, something hopeful. The New Dawn Motel was home.